All right, let's dive in. You ready? Today, we're going to tackle the relationship between trans rights and the larger LGBTQ plus rights movement.
Ooh, that's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. You know, we always hear about this idea of solidarity, but like, has it always been that way? Have trans folks always had the support of the broader gay and lesbian rights movement, or is it way more complicated than that?
It's definitely a lot more complicated, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, good. So we're in for a ride. All right, so our guide for this deep dive is this super thought-provoking article called "Why Are Trans People Being Abandoned? The Truth About LGBT Allies and the Fight for Liberation." It's by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks, and I gotta say, it really challenges a lot of assumptions I had going into this.
Yeah, for sure.
So one of the things that really struck me right off the bat was that, like, even before we get to the modern LGBTQ plus movement, laws criminalizing homosexuality, they often targeted anyone who defied gender norms.
Right, like it wasn't just about who you loved.
No.
It was about like how you presented yourself in public. It's like, how dare you?
Exactly. It was about controlling people's, appearances and behaviors.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Dr. Hoerricks points out these old masquerading laws in the US
Oh, yeah.
that basically outlawed wearing clothes that didn't match your assigned sex at birth, which is just wild to think about.
Yeah, wild is a good word for it. It's like, can you imagine getting arrested for wearing a dress if you're assigned male at birth?
It's like how did they even enforce that? That's just crazy.
Right. It really shows you how deep this obsession with policing gender goes.
Totally. And it makes you realize that for a long time, like simply looking different, like that was enough to be targeted. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point because it highlights this shared experience of oppression that trans folks, gender nonconforming folks, and even cis gay men and lesbians all face.
Like they were all in the same boat in a way.
Exactly. They were all seen as threats to this like rigid, gender binary that society was trying to uphold. And that shared experience, that's crucial, right? Because it's kind of what fueled that early resistance to this oppression.
That's right.
Like think about Stonewall, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everyone knows about Stonewall. It's like this iconic moment in LGBTQ plus history. But I think the mainstream narrative often, like, it kind of misses the mark in terms of who is really on the front lines.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the popular image of Stonewall often centers on, cis gay men. But the reality is that trans women, drag queens, and other gender nonconforming folks were right there in the thick of it.
They were leading the charge.
They were. And their names should be, like, household names,
Yeah.
Like Marsha P. Johnson. Sylvia Rivera. Stormy DeLarvery.
Yes, Stormy. I mean, these are
icons.
They're icons, and yet so often they're kind of left out of the story.
It's true.
And it makes you wonder, if they were leading the charge back then, what happened? Like, why aren't their names as well known as, say, Harvey Milk?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And that's where I think Dr. Hoerricks' article really starts to get, like, really interesting, because she digs into that.
Yeah. Tell me more.
So you see, in the aftermath of Stonewall, you have all these different groups popping up, right? Like the Gay Liberation Front or GLF, for example. They were like super radical.
Okay.
They were connecting the fight for queer rights to like all these other social justice movements.
So like they were intersectional, like before.
Exactly. They understood that different forms of oppression are all connected.
Okay.
Right. So they were fighting for Black liberation, feminism, anti-war protests. It was all intertwined.
So they weren't just focused on like one narrow issue.
Yeah.
They were fighting for liberation on like multiple fronts.
Exactly. And, crucially, they included trans people as a vital part of their coalition.
So they got it.
Yeah. They understood that the fight for liberation had to be inclusive.
That sounds amazing. Like, so powerful.
It was a really powerful moment.
But then I'm guessing, according to the article, things start to change. Like a split starts to form, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. So by the early 70s, you start to see more like mainstream gay and lesbian organizations gaining influence.
Okay.
Groups like the Gay Activists Alliance or GAA, they really focus their energy on securing rights specifically for cis gay men and lesbians.
So they split off from the GLF and took a different approach?
Exactly. They were less interested in like dismantling the whole system and more focused on like working within the system to achieve specific goals.
So instead of trying to like completely change the game, they were trying to play the game, trying to prove they were normal and deserved rights just like everyone else.
Exactly. They adopted what's known as respectability politics, which basically means trying to gain acceptance by conforming to the dominant culture's norms and expectations.
Okay, hold on. Respectability politics. You mentioned that was kind of a turning point.
Right.
Help me understand, like, why was that idea so harmful to trans folks, especially back then?
Well, think about it this way. If your goal is to show that you're just as normal as the dominant group,
Right.
anyone who challenges those norms, anyone who's seen as like too different or too radical, becomes a liability.
I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
And trans people, by their very existence, they disrupt the idea that gender and sex are, fixed and binary.
So they didn't fit into that neat little box that the mainstream movement was trying to create?
Exactly.
So you're saying that initial unity, like that, we're all outsiders, we're all in this together, feeling that got lost as the movement kind of like tried to gain mainstream acceptance.
In a lot of ways, yeah. It's like the movement started to prioritize assimilation over liberation.
And that, honestly, that's kind of tragic.
It is. It's a real loss.
Yeah.
And this shift really starts to show up in specific events, too. For instance, in 1973, you have Sylvia Rivera, a veteran of Stonewall.
Yeah, she was there at the beginning.
She was there, and
Right.
she was booed off the stage at the Christopher Street Liberation Day rally.
No way. What happened?
She was trying to speak up for the needs of trans and homeless youth, but the crowd, which was largely cis gay men and lesbians, they silenced her.
Imagine that. Like a Stonewall veteran
Stonewall veteran.
booed off the stage for trying to help the most vulnerable members of the community.
It's heartbreaking.
It really shows how the focus had shifted.
Yeah.
And, this exclusion wasn't an isolated incident, right?
Yeah.
Because that same year, trans women were banned from the Michigan Women's Music Festival.
That's right.
So it wasn't just gay and lesbian organizations. It was happening in feminist spaces, too.
Sadly, yeah. And this trend of pushing trans people out, it just continued throughout the 70s and 80s.
So, like, even as the LGBTQ plus movement was gaining some ground,
Right.
trans folks were being left behind.
It's a complicated and often painful history.
Yeah.
But it's important to understand it if we want to move forward in a more just and equitable way.
Okay, so we've set the stage. We've talked about this, early period of shared oppression and resistance. And then this shift towards respectability politics that started to marginalize trans folks.
Right, exactly.
So where do we go from here? Like, how did this dynamic continue to play out in the decades that followed?
Well, that's what we're going to dig into next.
Okay, so buckle up, folks. This is about to get even more interesting.
Yeah, stay tuned.
It's heartbreaking to hear how, like, trans folks were pushed aside, even after being so instrumental in the early fight for LGBTQ plus rights.
Yeah, it's a painful truth for sure.
It's like once some progress was made, the mainstream movement kind of forgot about its roots.
Right. And, Dr. Hoerricks really argues that this shift towards respectability politics, it really took hold in the 80s.
Okay.
Like, the focus became proving that gay and lesbian people were just as normal as heterosexuals, deserving of the same rights, like military service, marriage, all that.
Which, like, on the surface, it sounds like a good thing, right? Like, wanting equal rights, wanting to be seen as, like, part of society.
Totally.
But I can see how that focus on, like, fitting in could end up excluding those who, like, don't fit the mold.
Exactly. And trans people, whose very existence challenges traditional ideas about gender, they became inconvenient for this narrative.
Yeah, it's like, we'll get to you later.
Right.
But later never seems to come.
Exactly.
So Dr. Hoerricks calls the 90s and 2000 the period of, like, tokenism, not real inclusion. What does she mean by that? Like, the T was added to the acronym.
Right.
Right, like LGBTQ became LGBTQ plus.
Yeah, the T got added, but often it felt more like a checkbox than genuine commitment,
Right.
It was a way for mainstream organizations to, like, appear inclusive without actually doing the work to support trans communities.
I see. It was more about optics than substance.
Pretty much, yeah.
I remember reading about, like, the controversy around the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, or NDA, back in the 2007.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty clear example of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. So EDA was initially introduced without any protections for gender identity.
Right.
And guess what? Some major LGBTQ plus organizations,
Right.
including the Human Rights Campaign,
HRC.
yeah, one of the biggest players, they actually supported this version of the bill, even though it completely excluded trans people.
So they were willing to, like, leave trans folks out just to get a win for cis, gay, and lesbian people.
It's a complicated situation, but yeah, that's one way to interpret it. They were prioritizing what they perceived as the most achievable goal, even if it meant sacrificing the needs of a more vulnerable group within the community.
And it even, after Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015, like the landmark Supreme Court ruling that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide.
Right. Huge victory.
Huge victory. But Dr. Hoerricks argues it didn't really do much for trans people specifically.
Right, like Obergefell was monumental, obviously, but it was framed as a victory for the entire LGBTQ plus community.
Right, like mission accomplished.
Yeah, as if the fight for equality was over, and that just wasn't true.
So while everyone was celebrating this, big step forward, trans folks were still facing discrimination, violence, lack of access to basic needs like healthcare.
Exactly. Like, the mainstream movement declared victory, but for many trans people, the fight for basic dignity and recognition was, and still is, far from over.
And that kind of brings us to the present day, right?
Yeah.
Where we're seeing this surge of anti-trans sentiment and legislation, specifically targeting trans youth and their families.
It's terrifying, honestly.
It is. It's really scary. And what's been the response from those big LGBTQ plus organizations, the ones that claim to represent the whole community?
Well, that's the truly disheartening part. The silence from many of these groups has been deafening.
It's almost like a betrayal, isn't
It's
it?
that way, yeah.
Like, after all that shared history, all that talk about solidarity, they're turning their backs on trans folks at the very moment they need support the most.
It's tough to see, for sure.
Like, where's the outrage? Where's the calls to action?
It's a complicated issue, and there are definitely many factors at play.
Right.
But Dr. Hoerricks argues that this silence, it's not surprising.
Okay.
It's kind of like the logical outcome of a movement that, despite adding the T, was never truly committed to trans liberation.
So if these big organizations aren't stepping up, where do we go from here? Like, where does the future of trans liberation lie?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks points to the power of grassroots movements, to those trans-led organizations that have been working tirelessly, often with very little resources, to support their communities.
Can you give me some examples of what that looks like on the ground?
Absolutely. One of the most powerful forms of resistance has been the rise of mutual aid networks. Think of it like community care in action. Trans folks coming together to support one another, providing direct assistance with things like housing, healthcare, legal aid, and just creating a sense of belonging and safety.
That's amazing.
Right.
Like they're filling the gaps where the system fails. They're creating their own safety net.
And it's not just about meeting basic needs either. These networks are also challenging the isolation that many trans people experience.
Right.
They're building community, fostering resilience, and saying, we're here, we're queer, and we're not going anywhere.
I love that.
Right.
It's so powerful.
It is.
Dr. Hoerricks also highlights the vital work being done by trans-led shelters and healthcare collectives. Those must be like literal lifelines for folks who are facing homelessness, violence, or just trying to access basic medical care.
They are, and they're doing this amazing work with very limited resources, often relying on volunteers and donations.
Yeah.
It's truly inspiring to see their dedication and resilience.
It almost feels like, in a way, trans folks are going back to their roots.
Right.
Like back to that spirit of self-reliance and mutual aid that existed before the mainstream movement kind of took over.
Right. I think you're right. There's a sense of reclaiming power, of saying, we don't need to wait for permission or approval from those in power. We can create the change we need ourselves.
And that's where the real hope lies, right? Not in assimilation, but in building something new. Something that truly reflects the needs and experiences of trans people.
Absolutely. It's about dismantling the systems that were never designed to include them and creating a world where they can not just survive, but thrive.
It sounds like Dr. Hoerricks is advocating for a pretty radical shift in how we think about gender and identity. She even mentions, looking to other revolutionary movements for inspiration.
Oh, yeah. She talks about Marx, Lenin, Mao, like thinkers who challenged the status quo and advocated for a complete overhaul of the existing power structure.
That's a bold comparison.
It is.
It's like she's saying, we need to stop trying to fit into a system that was designed to exclude us. We need to create something entirely new.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
So if respectability politics isn't the answer, what is? Like, how do we move towards this radical vision of trans liberation?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks emphasizes the need for grassroots organizing, for building movements that are rooted in community and solidarity.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the power of collective action and the importance of centering the voices and leadership of trans people themselves.
So less top-down, more bottom-up.
Exactly. It's about shifting power away from those big institutions and back into the hands of the communities most impacted.
This has been a lot to process, honestly.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It's been heartbreaking to hear about the ways in which trans people have been marginalized and abandoned, but also, like, inspiring to see the resilience and resistance of these grassroots movements.
I agree. And it's important to remember that this isn't just a history lesson.
Right.
It's a call to action.
So what does that look like for someone like me? Someone who wants to be a better ally to trans folks?
Well, I think the first step is to educate yourself, to keep learning about trans history, about the issues facing trans communities today, and about the ways in which you can contribute to the fight for trans liberation.
And to be honest, that might mean unlearning some of the things we thought we knew about the LGBTQ plus movement, right?
Yeah. You're right. We need to be willing to question the dominant narratives and seek out alternative perspectives, especially those of trans people themselves.
It's not enough to just be aware, though, right? We need to take action.
Absolutely. True allyship requires more than just words.
Right.
It requires putting our bodies, our resources, and our privilege on the line to support trans-led movements and initiatives.
So we've talked about how, trans folks have been, like, pushing for true liberation, often outside of those, like, big mainstream LGBTQ plus organizations. And it feels like a really crucial moment, Honestly, I'm left wondering, like, what does effective allyship look like in this context?
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
It's a great question, and I think Dr. Hoerricks offers some really, powerful insights on this.
Okay.
She argues that the first step is, acknowledging that true allyship can't be passive.
Right.
It's not enough to just say, oh, I support trans rights.
Right. It's got to be more than
You have to, actively work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate transphobia and oppression.
That sounds pretty intense, I got to say.
Yeah.
Like, what does that even look like practically?
Well, I mean, it starts with, being willing to put your resources on the line,
Okay.
That could mean donating to trans-led organizations, volunteering your time, or using your platform to amplify trans voices.
So, like, getting involved directly, supporting those who are already doing the work on the ground.
Exactly.
Okay, what else? What else comes to mind?
Another crucial aspect of allyship is being willing to challenge transphobia wherever you encounter it.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
That means, calling out transphobic jokes, correcting misinformation, and having those, difficult conversations with friends and family members who might hold, harmful views.
Yeah, those conversations can be, really tough, but I can see how they're, essential for creating real change,
For sure.
It's like you can't just stay silent when you see injustice happening.
Silence is complicity.
Exactly.
And remember, allyship is a journey, not a destination, right? It's a constant process of learning, unlearning, and reevaluating your own biases and assumptions.
Speaking of unlearning, Dr. Hoerricks also encourages us to really examine our own understanding of the LGBTQ plus rights movement. She suggests that the history we've been taught often leaves out the contributions and struggles of trans people.
Totally. For too long, the narrative has been centered on the experiences of cis gay men and lesbians,
Right.
while trans folks have been relegated to the sidelines or erased altogether.
So part of being an effective ally is doing our own research, digging deeper, and seeking out those untold stories.
Exactly. Read books by trans authors, watch documentaries about trans history, and listen to podcasts like this one that center trans voices and perspectives.
I gotta admit, going through this deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah.
I thought I knew a decent amount about LGBTQ plus history, but it's clear I still have a lot to learn.
That's the beauty of being a lifelong learner. There's always more to discover, and the more we learn about the struggles and triumphs of trans people, the better equipped we'll be to support their fight for liberation.
So, circling back to our original question, where do we go from here? It feels like a lot of responsibility, but also a powerful opportunity to be part of creating a more just and equitable world,
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Allyship isn't about guilt or perfection.
Right.
It's about showing up with humility and a willingness to learn and grow. It's about recognizing that the fight for trans liberation is a fight for all of us, and that we're all better off when everyone has the freedom to live authentically and express themselves fully.
So well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
This deep dive it's been challenging, inspiring, and ultimately, I think, hopeful. It's reminded me that even in the face of like so much adversity,
Mm-hmm.
there's always the possibility for change, and that we all have a role to play in creating that change.
Couldn't agree more. It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
Likewise. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you'll keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a future where trans liberation is a reality for everyone.